So my name is David Delabassée. I work at Oracle in the FN Developer Relation team. And today I'm going to discuss about FN project, which is an open source FaaS platform. Before I do so, I just want to excuse me, share a few facts about Belgium, where I'm coming from. Because Belgium is a very small country. I think in terms of population, Belgium is like Portugal. But in terms of surface, it's way smaller than Portugal. But at least in Belgium, we are a small country, but we have something which is quite good, and that's the Belgian cuisine, the food. So in Belgium, we have very good foods, like the Belgian beers, over 1,600 different types of beer. And in fact, Belgian beer have been put to the UNESCO heritage list. So it shows how serious we are with beer in Belgium. Chocolate, Belgian chocolate, the best chocolate in the world. We produce more than 20 kilograms per inhabitants per year, so that's quite a lot. And then we have these. Anybody who knows what this is? No, not French fries, fries. No, I'm serious about that. So there is if you go to the fries Wikipedia page, there is a whole section that basically go over the battle between France and Belgium. And we have all the arguments on our side. Fries are coming from Belgium, not from France. And finally, we have these, the Brussels sprout. Anybody enjoy the Brussels sprout? Whoa, I'm really sorry for you. And I have my own theory that I'm pretty sure that the Brussels sprouts are not coming from Brussels, nor from Belgium, but they are coming from France. So anyway, let's discuss about FN project, an open source container native FaaS platform. So I will first spend a few minutes to set the context, explain what serverless is and so on, and then I will show you FN in action. So it's a FaaS platform. At the heart of any FaaS platform, we have this notion of a function. A function is basically a very well-defined piece of code that has an input, and most of the time will produce an output based on that input. So we have this very well-limited piece of code, and then we have this as a service piece. That's basically the compute element on which your function will run on. And the main idea with FaaS and serverless is that basically you, as a user of a FaaS platform, will not have to worry about that compute element. So basically someone else will have to manage that platform for you. So you, as a developer, will just focus on writing function, nothing else. There are many reasons why you might want to go towards a FaaS platform. At the end of the day, it's just easier. Given that you just have to focus on writing function, well, you can just do that. So you don't have to worry about managing the infrastructure, about patching the infrastructure, about scaling the infrastructure, and so on and so on. It's someone else's job to do that. So at the end of the day, you should also be able to iterate and innovate faster. And something that we don't really mention, that's FaaS has also a strong economic angle. Given that we have this very well-defined piece of code that will be running on a platform, that basically allows the platform owner to increase the density. And the savings that the FaaS platform owner will do at the end of the day should be reflected on what you will pay. And basically, by increasing the density, we can have different type of billings. And the main idea with FaaS is that you should only pay when your functions are being consumed. If your functions are not used, you shouldn't pay a dime. So there is a whole economic angle to the story of FaaS and serverless that I will not discuss about today because it's really a technical presentation. So some time ago, we at Oracle started to work on a FaaS platform. At some point in time, we will have Oracle Functions, which is based on FN. So when we started to work on that, we set ourselves some goals. So for one of the things so we basically ask ourselves, okay, what do we want to achieve? What should our FaaS platform have in terms of requirements? So first, it has to be open source. given that we are quite late in the game and that we are Oracle, we want to make sure that there's no lock-in to any vendor, including Oracle. So that's why from the beginning on, we say that everything has to be open source. It should be approachable. Given that we are talking to developers, we want to make sure that it's very easy to get started with, but we don't want to prevent anybody to do more advanced stuff if that person wants to do so. So simple things should be easy, but that doesn't preclude to do more advanced and complex stuff. We also said from the beginning that it should be based on containers. So you will see through my demos that basically we are using under-the-hood containers. Now, it's not something that you don't necessarily need to know, because all the tooling is basically handling that complexity for you. But basically, we thought that it would be very useful to leverage the Docker ecosystem for our FaaS platform. In terms of scheduler, we want it to be independent. Having said that, we, as a company, have made a choice for Kubernetes, but there's nothing specific in FN. So basically, given that everything is open source, you can take FN and deploy it on top of Kubernetes or on top of Mesos or something else. So that also means that you can take FN and deploy it on any cloud provider at the end of the day. We also said from the beginning that FN should be language independent. So if we are talking to Java developers, we need to provide them the tools that they are using today, Java tools. But if we are talking to JavaScript developers, we don't want to ask them to write function in Java. So you will see that basically in FN you can write function using different type of language. And also, we want it to be platform independent. At the end of the day, if you are using a FaaS platform, you will likely use FN on managed services from a provider like Oracle, for example. But given that everything is open source, you can take FN and deploy it on someone else's cloud or on premises. Obviously, if you are deploying FN on premises, that basically means that you will lose one of the core ID of serverless. That means that someone will have to manage the platform in your company. But if you understand that, that's a perfectly good solution. And I think that's what Steve mentioned as own FaaS this morning during the keynote. And also, something which is also quite nice, if you are developing using FN, you just install FN on your laptop, and there you go. It's not a simulation or an environment, it's really the real thing that we can use locally. So that basically led to the creation of Project FN, which was launched less than a year ago, in September, at Java 1. Everything is open source, so github.com/FN project, that's the GitHub organization. You can go there and you will have all the stuff. So let's now quickly talk about FN, and then we'll show FN in action. As I mentioned, at the heart of any FaaS platform, we have function. In FN, function happen to be containers. So the containers will get its input via std in, it will produce its output via std out, and if something goes wrong, it can use std error to basically log what has been wrong. But you, as a developer, doesn't really need to know that. You will see that all the tooling that we are providing is hiding the complexity of wrapping a function into a container, dealing with the input, the output, and so on. Now, if we look at the FN architecture, I don't want to go in any detail because I really want to focus on the developer side. But we have a bunch of FN servers. That's basically where your function will run. Obviously, if you want to scale, you will need to have more than one FN server. If you have more than one FN server, you need to have an FN load balancer that will basically do the load balancing between the different servers. So if there is an incoming request coming for a given function, from a performance point of view, it would make sense to route directly that request to an FN server that is already able to serve that given request. So that's typically what the load balancer will do. But again, if you are using FN through a provider, that's not something that you will have to take care of. You, as a developer, will mainly use the CLI. So the CLI is basically your gateway to FN. So what we're also providing is a bunch of FDK, function development kits, that will help you to write function in given language, such as Java, Go, and so on. And last but not least, we also have a very nice feature which is called FN Flow that basically gives us the ability to write a long-running function. And I will come back do that later on. So, well, let's move on and let's look at an example. So, obviously, FN support Java. So, sorry, let me get rid of that. But before going to Java, let's just, yep, sorry, maybe. Oops. Arrangement, yeah. Yep. So what I will first do, I will create a function using Go. So for that, I'm using the CLI, so FN, and then init is basically used to bootstrap a function. Given that I want to have a Go function, I will specify that I want to use the Go runtime, and then I just need to give my function a name. So if we look at the Go directory, we have a few files that have been created. The main one is this one, the func.go. That's the function itself. So it's basically a hello world function that we can evolve. Let's just do that using code. So this is the sample function that has been created. It's basically just an hello world function. We have this file, which is key. It basically contains some metadata for the function. So the name of the function, the version of the function, the runtime to use, the entry point, and the format that we want to use. So what I've done here, I've just created a very simple function. So now what I can do, I can run my function. So for that, I will use again the CLI. But this time, I will use the run command. And I will specify the verbose parameter to see what's going on. Oops. Oh, sorry. It's FN verbose, I think it's that. And you see that when I'm running the function, basically what the CLI is doing, it wraps the function in a Docker container for me. So it's not something that I have to do myself. And this is the result, whoops. This is the result of the function that is being run. So this is the output. And for example, if I say something like that, I can JNation. I run the function again, but this time I'm piping in some information, so the function will be run again. And it doesn't work. No, I'm not sure what's going on there. But anyway, so now let's create the same function, but using the Java runtime this time, because it's a Java conference. So let's look at what has been created. So I've used the same command, fninit, but this time I've specified that I want to use the Java runtime. So we have a bunch of files that has been created, and you see that we have a POM. So basically, our function is just a Maven project. So it goes with the idea that if you're a Java developer, you want to continue to use the tools that you're using today. So we are just creating a Maven project. If we look at the source, this is the function that has been created. So there's nothing fancy. So it's a simple class with one method. It gets something in input, and it produces an output. And you know what? I will use IntelliJ instead. Given that it's a Java project, it makes more sense. OK, so this is the POM. Let's look at the class. So this is the class, so nothing fancy here. And here you see that we also have a test class that has been created. And this is in fact a JUnit test that we can use to directly test the function. So if I test that function, if it's so run hello function test, if everything goes well, it should be green. And you see that indeed there's one test and it works. And obviously, if I change my test, if I run it again, it should go red. And it fails. Okay, so now what can we do? Well, we have a POM here. So what we can do, for example, we can use external dependency. Let's see. No. So this is a standard dependency that I'm importing. So that means that if I go back to my function now, I should be, if I import my change, obviously. So now I should be able to do something like big money, m equal big money of, let's say that, well, euro, 9 euro, okay? Okay, so now if I run my function again, fn run, the name of the function is Duke. So the image here is being built because I've changing the code of my function, so it takes a bit of time, and it fails. Anybody has an idea why? Yeah, the test. So we can fix the test. That's a joke. Well, anyway, I will do that, but in a more gentle way. So properties, and I think it's skip test. I really don't have the time to update the test all the time, right? So that's why the POM is for. So if I run the function again, this time, if everything goes well, oh, I didn't import my change, so maybe it will not work. Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah. So you see that I've used, just by updating my POM, an external dependency. It's just a Maven project at the end. So if we go back to the function, we see that this function, basically, in this case, is getting a string in input, and it produces a string as output. It's okay, but it's not something that is particularly useful. So what we can do, and that's something that is provided by the FDK, is something like this. So I can say that I have a person private, if I can type, string. So a person has a first name and a last name. So I have this object type now. Oops. 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 So I need a default constructor. I also need getter and setters. Well, in fact, I just need getters, but it doesn't matter. Yep. So what I can do now, I can say that this function, instead of, for example, returning a string, this function can return a person, right? So that obviously means that I need to change this guy. Well, no, let's do it this way. So let's keep string here. And I can say that this function is returning a string, but it gets a person as an input, right? So now I don't need that guy. And given that I have this input object, I can say, for example, that, well, I want to just hide the name of the person. So, and then I will just return, well, the object itself. Obviously, I need to update here. So the function gets a person type, and it produces a person object. So given that I've said that my function will get a person object, a Java object, I need to basically pass that to my function. I will do that using JSON. So I need to create that payload through a JSON object. So I said that a person as a last name and a person as a first name, right? So David. Okay. Okay, so this is the payload that I will pass to my function. So to do that, I just cat in my payload and then fn run and my function. And you see that we have the output, which is a JSON output. So the last name has been hidden, and the first name is still the same. But you see that on the Java side, the only thing I had to do is to keep working with pure Java code. I didn't have to bother with the JSON binding, because this is something that is provided by the FDK. And obviously, the JSON binding, so binding to JSON document to Java object has a default behavior, but we have the ability to override that behavior. So let's do another example. So what I've done here, I've basically used fninit to bootstrap function. What I can also do, I will use the runtime go, and this time I will code that function go b. I can also use the CLI to test my function. So if I look here, I have this test.json that is provided. So for Java, I have the JUnit harness test that I can use to test my function. But for other language, we also provide some default testing capabilities. So this file basically contains a test scenario. So we pass this input to the function, and it should produce that output. So if I do an fn test, that will test my function using those scenarios. So given that it's the first time I was running that function, it has to be built first. So the function is being wrapped into a container, and then the Docker container are invoked using the scenarios, and you see that in this case, it works. What I've done until now, I've used Docker to run my function locally. Obviously, at the end of the day, you want to deploy your function on a managed platform, on FN servers running in the cloud. So that's obviously something that we can do. For that, we just need to create what we call an application. An application is basically just a grouping of functions. So I will create the JNation application. So that means that now I can deploy, let's see, so deploy local, I think it's app JNation, and I will deploy this function locally. So given that I'm in the function directory, I don't have to specify the function. So the function is being built, and it's deployed to my FN server. So now if I look at, it's root, list, and I think it's app. Oops. We're in the middle of changing the command, so that's why I'm a little bit confused. And it's just the app name, JNation. So roots list all the roots for the JNation application. There is just one. So I can invoke that function now that is running on an FN server. In this case, it happens to be running on my machine. But I can curl that function, obviously, given that it has an HTTP endpoint, so I can reach it through its HTTP endpoint, or I can also use the CLI to directly call my function. So JNation, and in the JNation app, I want to use the gob function, and it's the same result. So let's go back to the slideshow from here. So FN is written technically in Go, but obviously, given that we're Oracle, there is a strong emphasis on making sure that Java runs very well on top of FN. So we're providing the FDK. The FDK provides, for example, the input and output coercion to a Java object. It provides the JUnit harness tests. Everything is wrapped as a Maven project, so you can continue to use the Java tools that you're using today. Nothing is changing on that front. Obviously, it's not just Java. If you're a Go developer, you want to keep using Go. So out of the box, we support Java, Go, Python, JavaScript, and a few other. And I'm always confused if it's Ruby or, well, anyway. But given that we are using Docker containers, we also provide you the ability to easily add your own language. So if that list is not enough for you, you have the ability to add support for the language that you would like to see. And that's what I did for Kotlin. So a few months ago, Kotlin was not supported by FN. And now, if you do FN init, runtime Kotlin, you give your function a name. So what I've just created here is this function. So if we look at its metadata, so that's the name of the function, the version of the function, and this time we want to use the Kotlin runtime. That's the command. So the command is basically the Java class and the method where my Kotlin code resides. And well, I will skip all the other details. But we are also generating the harness test that you can use to test your Kotlin function. And if we look at the code of the Kotlin function, well, if you understand Kotlin, you will see that it's indeed Kotlin. So for example, I can say turn those into data class. So obviously, I have the ability to run my Kotlin function, so run kota, but it will fail. It will fail because I'm using the FDK to basically, I'm saying that this function is getting input as parameter, and the parameter should be a name. So what I need to do, I need to pass it that name. Oops. So cat in JSON. So now if I do that using my Kotlin function, you see that this time it doesn't fail. So hello Delabassée. So that's the Kotlin hello world. So basically, if you want to add support for another language, you just need to know how to produce a runnable artifact, like using Kotlin C to produce a jar in this case, and how to run that artifact. And it's really all it takes to add other language support to FN. So that's something that you can easily do. So this morning in the keynote, Steve clearly mentioned that functions are stateless. And if you want to hold some state in your function, you basically need to rely on something external, like an external database, like an external message queue, like just a REST service that will hold some state and so on. But having said that, there are some use cases where it makes sense to hold within the function some notion of state. And that's when you want to combine multiple functions together. So just imagine the following scenario. So you have a function that will invoke another function based on the result of that second function. The main function will then evoke a third function, and maybe something goes wrong in that function, so the main function will then have to trigger something else. If you want to do that, obviously, the main function will have to hold some kind of state. And that's something that we do provide in FN, and it's called FN Flow. So if you have been using Java EC8, the completion stage API and the completable future API of Java EC8, it's basically the same concept. So the completable future in Java EC8 is basically some kind of asynchronous task that is running within the JVM, and on completion of that task, another async task can be triggered. So basically, you have the ability to chain multiple async task execution together. This is exactly the same idea, except that here we are talking about function which happen to be running on the infrastructure. So it's distributed. So everything will not run within a single process. Everything will run on top of the platform itself. So for that, we are providing the FN flow. Right now, we have a Java implementation. It's part of the FDK, the Java FDK, and we're working on the Go implementation. And to illustrate that in action, I have this demo. So this demo is basically a typical travel booking scenario. So I want to book a travel, so that means that I need to book a flight, then I need to book an hotel, and then I need to book a car. And finally, I want to send the user some kind of confirmation. So for that, I'm using multiple backend services, which are written using FN functions. So one is written using Java. The hotel one is using is written using Ruby. The car rental services is written using JavaScript, and so on and so on. It doesn't really matter. And what we'll focus on is on this trip booking function that will basically have to invoke the multiples functions to basically book a trip. So let's see. So everything is already installed in my machine, and I will focus on this trip function. And I have the travel application that is exposing all this function. So I will focus on the bottom one, on the trip one. Oh, sorry, not code. I want to use IntelliJ. So this is the trip function. Again, this is a standard Java project. So let me zoom that. And what I want to do here is to look at the trip function, which is here. Oops. Let me zoom that a little bit. I just need to use that Docker command because I have some issue on my machine. Okay. So this function is basically empty right now. So the only thing that it does is it creates a flow object. So this is basically your entry point to the FN Flow API. So what I'm doing next is this. So I'm creating multiple flow features. So a flow feature is basically a feature object that will contain at some point in time the result of a remote function invocation. So the first flow feature will contain at some point in time the result of the flight booking invocation. The second one will contain the result of the hotel booking invocation. And finally, the third one will contain the car booking result at some point in time. It will contain the result or maybe and possibly an error if something goes wrong. Then it's just a matter of basically defining the execution of those multiple requests like you would do using the completion stage API. So flight features basically mean we first want to have to invoke in an async fashion the booking flight. Then compose basically mean once we have the result from that function invocation, we want to pass that result to the second invocation, which will book an hotel. Then compose basically mean once we have the result from the hotel, we want to book the car. And finally, once we have the result of all those function invocation, we want to invoke the final function, which will in turn send a mail to the user with the given confirmation. So let's save that guy and let's deploy it. FN deploy local app travel. Yes, that's good. That's the trip function. So I'm deploying this trip function now to my FN server. Let's deploy. And to trigger it, I just have to pass it some payload, some sample payload with the flight that I want to book and so on. So let's run that guy. Fn call travel, and it's the trip function. It works. Well, it was a joke. No, the thing is that we don't see what's going on. So luckily, I have this tool, which basically will give me some visual indication of what's going on. So if I invoke it again, so we see that basically we have invoked the flight booking, the hotel booking, the car booking, and finally we send a mail to the user. I have a different view that basically show the same thing. So let's create this. So this is all the services that I have running on my machine, and I will invoke it again. So we book the car, we book the hotel, we book the car, we book the flight, and finally we send the email. So this is FN flow in action. The thing that we don't do here is dealing with error. So if any of the booking fail, well, too bad for us. So let's update that. So this is the same flow, but this time we are using the exceptionally compose to basically react on error that might be raised by remote function. So the idea is that if we have one of the error in the booking, we want to make sure that we cancel the whole trip. So if we were able to book the flight, but we are not able to book the hotel, we want to make sure that we cancel the whole thing, so the flight and the hotel and the car. And finally, we are also using this exceptionally to, so what we are doing, we are rolling back all the booking that we have done, and finally we will send a mail to the user saying, sorry, we are not able to book your flight, your whole trip, sorry. So let's clear that guy. Let's deploy this function again. It was very quick. Did I say my source? Okay. Yep. So, let's see. The problem that I have here is that obviously my services are working, so it's kind of hard to show something failing. But that's what I have here. So anytime now I will book a car, it will just fail. So let's see. Let's see if it works. So we book the hotel, we were not able to book the car, we were able to book the flight, but we'll just cancel the whole thing, and finally we will send an email to the user saying that we're sorry, but we're not able to do your booking. We can have a different view of that. So we were not able again to book the car, so we have to roll back all the booking, and finally we send the email to the user saying, sorry, for some reason we're not able to do what you have done, what you have requested. So this is in a nutshell how FN Flow works. The thing that is important with Flow is that, so we want to provide this capability, but we want to make sure that we are giving you the tool that you're using today. So if you are a Java developers, you want to have a Java API. So that's basically what FN Flow is about. And then, I mean, that was a very quick overview of FN. We're also, it's open source, so you can exactly see what's going on. So for example, we have recently added support for Spring Cloud Function. We also provide the ability to see what's going on within the platform. So if something goes wrong, well, you want to understand what was wrong. So for example, if one of your function fails, obviously you need to have the ability to see why the function fails. So if you are using Java and the function has raised an exception, you need to have access to that. So that's information that we're providing through different means, including through the CLI. And we continue to work on improving FN. So, for example, something that we do provide, we provide cold startup and hot startup. So the idea, as you show in the previous session, so if we have a container that is already started to serve a given function, it might be useful to keep it running for a while if another similar function is request for that function is coming. So just reduce the startup time, those kind of things. But keeping running a container will cost in resources, and you don't want to pay for unused resources. So what we can also do, we can froze that container. It's an in-between solution to reduce the startup time. We have recently added support for the serverless frameworks. So that's something which is quite nice. If you have been using, for example, the serverless framework on top of AWS Lambda, you can continue to use the serverless framework, but this time using FN. And we are really working on improving the project. So for example, we have a Helm chart that helps you to install FN on top of Kubernetes. So there are a lot of nice things going on. So in recap, FN, it's a container native. You've seen that under the hood we are using Docker. You don't need to know how to use Docker. I mean, it's something that is fully handled by the tool. All it takes to use FN on your machine is to have Docker running. So if you have Docker running, you just install FN. It's supplied as a Docker container, so it's very easy to do. FN is cloud agnostic, so at some point in time, Oracle will have a managed version of FN, Oracle function. But given that everything is open source, you can basically fetch the repo, you clone the repo, and there you go. You can go on someone else's cloud if you want to. It's polyglot. So we are supporting Java, Go, JavaScript, Python, but you also saw that we can easily add support, or you can add support, in fact, for other language. That's something that is perfectly possible. And last but not least, we have the FN CLI. So it's really your entry point to the complete FN infrastructure. So you saw FN init to bootstrap a function, FN test to test the function, FN run to run the function locally using Docker, FN deploy to deploy your function on top of a managed FN infrastructure, and finally FN call to invoke a given function. So if we look back at the goal and the requirement that we set when we started to work on FN, I think that we are quite there. So FN is platform independent. You can run it from your laptop to a cloud provider. It's scheduler independent. It's Docker based. It's open source. It's not open core. So really everything that is on the GitHub FN organization is what we will use for Oracle Cloud Function. So there are no specific features that are behind closed door. And it's very approachable. So FN is very easy to use. You just need to have Docker installed, and there you go, you can start. So with that, I would like to thank you for your time. Obrigado. I will leave you with a few resources. So 3 things you have to remember. So I encourage you to check the GitHub FN organization and give it a try. You will see that in less than 10 minutes, you will be up and running. And then Belgian fries and the French sprout. So thank you. So we have a few minutes for questions. So yes, sir. Sorry.
Thank you. Is a function hell a thing already?
Is a function what?
Hell. So I'm just thinking that in the course of a project, a larger project, you start to build similar functions and different versions of the same functions that you may want to run together to support different versions of clients or some other case.
We do support versioning of function, but not like, at this stage we don't have the ability, for example, using the load balancer to say that, for example, for this traffic we want to route to that version of the function. Is that something that you would like to do?
That is one thing that I would like to see, yes.
We are working on that, but it's not there yet.
But I'm also thinking about when you start to write different functions based on the same, okay, slight variations, and over the course of, let's say, a couple of years, you end up with 1,000 functions on your project.
Yes.
So how do you manage that?
So yeah, the granularity that we have is, so we have the function and then we have the apps. So an application is basically a grouping of a function. So at this stage, you would probably have to use the application to basically deal with that kind of versioning issue. So you would have an application that would basically handle the version 1 of your function, and then for version 2, you would have a different application. Not
all right?
sure.
All right.
I'm not sure I answer your question.
Well, I'm thinking more in the sense that let's think about a typical Java project,
Yeah.
right? Where you end up having to have fine-tuned actions. You end up by extracting some code from one method, making it more abstract, and having some other methods that receive different parameters. Okay, and you end up with some spaghetti code after a few years, right? I'm thinking about the same thing. I'll give you a proper example. In your example, you have one function to send a success email.
Yeah.
Okay, it receives, I think, 3 or 4 parameters, right?
Yeah.
You may end up deciding to have a different type of trip where you only need 2. So you may write a similar function.
Yeah.
Is that something you would do?
That's something that you can do, but the platform today will not provide you some kind of abstraction to do that. Now, something that we should maybe have discussed is the use case. So the idea of a serverless, of a FaaS platform is basically to give you the ability to have a short-lived function. So you will not write a full-blown application using function. We're talking about short-lived function, which basically do one thing. So it gets something in input and it produces an output. So trying to use any kind of serverless platform for writing full-fledged application is not a good idea. The thing that we are providing on top of our function platform is FNflow that allows you to easily compose together multiple functions together. But I mean, it's not a universal solution that you can write every kind of application. So maybe that's where we are not in sync.
Yeah, it's a new concept, so I'm trying to wrap my mind around it.
Yeah. So again, a function basically gets something in input and it provides an output, and it's short-lived by nature. It's stateless, so it will live for 100 milliseconds, maybe 200 at worst case, 1 second if something is very computing intensive, and so on. So it's not a full-fledged application by nature.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Going once, going twice.
It's the lunch. And I've been told they have French sprouts, so.
So yeah, it's lunch. You can just get out, go to the left, and on the far right, you'll have something to eat. Enjoy.
Thank you.